Alright, andyan na mga kasama natin. Pumasok na. Let's get the ball rolling. Alright. Okay. Pag-usapan natin to. Pag-usapan natin to. Kamusta kayo dyan mga kameta? Ito na. This is it. Let's go serious, no? Medyo technical, medyo serious ang discussion natin today. Hindi na mga Karens of the Philippines, hindi Karenism or Karen Republic. Mamaya na natin pag-usapan ng Philippine Airlines among others. Mamaya din natin pag-usapan mga away ng mga Marcoses, sibling rivalry supposedly, or yung pagbisita ni Marcos Jr. sa Estados Unidos. Pag-usapan natin yan in the coming days mga kameta. For tonight, what I want to talk about is something that I've been following very closely, not only over the past few weeks or days, but actually over the years, no? Because if you are following news mga kameta, malalaman nyo na isang malaking issue ngayon is whether magkakaroon ng karibal ang US dollar, specifically from China and the broader BRICS countries. No? Ito yung Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then sinama din yung South Africa dyan mga kameta. Pag-usapan natin yan, whether this is feasible, whether this is something that we should take seriously, and how seriously should we take it, and how imminent is the supposed end of the US dollar hegemony. Kasi mga kameta, since the end of Second World War, the US dollar has been the global currency reserve. So even when bating US economy in trouble, because yun yung global reserve currency, diyan pumunta sa US dollar ang mga investors, diyan pumunta yung mga sa US dollar sa mga central banks sa ibang countries, ordinary people. So the US dollar has an adverse tendency in a sense that sometimes it's divorced from the economic reality, including the health of the US economy, right? And this is something that has been irking a lot of people for quite some time, including some leading figures from the West. Pag-usapan natin yan si Charles de Gaulle from France. But most recently, of course, it was Lula Ignacio de Silva, the president of Brazil, who also raised the possibility of ending the US dollar hegemony and starting more trading in renminbi, Chinese renminbi, or other currency to settle trades and investment among different countries. Now, maraming mga myths dyan, maraming mga simplification dyan, maraming mga kaewanan dyan, maraming mga vested interests dyan, maraming mga ideological commentaries dyan. So the best way to deal with this mga kameta is to look at actual numbers. So I have a lot of graphs and data that I've prepared for you, not to mention readings for you guys to check on your own. Alright? Really interesting articles are coming out right and left mga kameta. So I really suggest you guys to read about it, including two important academic works. One is by Berkeley economist Barry Eichengreen, which looks at the emergence of renminbi as a global currency without going through the conventional current account liberalization scheme. And the other one is looking at how China's financial technological innovation, especially using more and more, Alipay or other kind of cryptocurrencies, that may actually also accelerate China's ability to become a major global currency in the way that it's still not. So we'll look at those studies very shortly, and then ipopost ko rin sa inyo yung links to those studies para ma-appreciate nyo on your own mga kameta. Of course, there are a lot of writings out there, but I think special shout out goes to the works of Neil Ferguson. Not always a fan of Neil Ferguson because there is some medyo malabo at ideological yung mga arguments niya, minsan in terms of fiscal conservatism and libertarian economics, but he is the author of a fascinating book called The Ascent of Money, right? It's, I think, one of the best books out there about finance, and it takes a long jury or long view of history and emergence of money. So I really suggest you guys to read it. Super galing yung pagkagawa na itong libro niya. And by the way, good news dun sa mga ayaw magbasa or tamad magbasa, there's actually documentary series of that actually won an Emmy Award, no? So this is by Neil Ferguson, an extremely charismatic and articulate historian, former in Oxford and Harvard, but now he's actually there in Stanford University, no? At the Hoover Institution. So I really suggest you guys to read that. So that's why pagdating sa financial history, as much as mahal na mahal natin yung iba, katulad ni sila Adam Tooze, among others, I think you have to really give credit where credit is due when it comes to Neil Ferguson. So ito pa yung book na sinasabi ko by Neil Ferguson, The Ascent of Money. He explains the emergence of the modern financial capitalist system by going all the way back, mga kameta. So I really suggest you guys to read this book by Neil. Balikan natin yan, mga kameta. Let's go now to the meat of discussion. Now, where did all of this big talk about BRICS start? Unang-una, ano pa yung BRICS? So this is the grouping of Brazil, Russia, India, China. Natatawa tayo kasi doon online may mga troll na inattack nila. Alam ba ni Hidarian ganito si BRICS? Parang, dude, before you even knew there was a Twitter on Earth or before you even knew there was a BRICS, I was already writing on this, right? Whether as a student or whether as a scholar, right? So BRICS actually was a term coined by the Goldman Sachs, a hedge fund, financial institution in the Wall Street that look at the potential of major post-colonial or developing countries, specifically their ability to become the new pivots of global economy. So I think report back in 2001, this is by Jim O'Neill. It was very famous. It made a lot of sense. Initially, it was just BRIC, Brazil, Russia, India, China, pero sinama rin yung South Africa later on, out of both political and to a certain degree also objective economic uh, calculus. Now, this was actually less done by the Wall Street, but by political leaders because by the end of the 2000s, actually Russia, if I'm not mistaken, Russia hosted one of the first summits of the so-called BRIC leaders. I think in St. Petersburg, right? So what was a Goldman Sachs report becomes a geopolitical reality because na-realize ng Russia, India, China, and Brazil that not only are they booming, but they have a greater chance of making their voice heard if they come together. And then later on, sinama na rin yung South Africa so that there's a more representation across different continents. On the surface, of course, they may all look like the new emerging superpowers, but they're extremely different economies. China is a global manufacturing powerhouse. South Africa is a semi-developed country, but also a post-industrial country. Russia is similarly a post-industrial country with a shrinking population. Brazil used to have an immense manufacturing sector, but increasingly Brazil is becoming a more of an agriculture exporting country. And then India, very service-dominated economy. So, super iba-iba po yung kanilang mix and matches. And of course, one big implication of that is if these countries want to trade with each other, how much complementarity there is. Kasi kung similar yung exports nila, sabi natin, Brazil and Russia, more raw material exporters, and both of them, their market is primarily China, it's hard to talk about a significant trade dynamic change between, let's say, Brazil or Russia for that matter, right? So complementarity is also something that you have to keep in mind, not to mention competition among some of these major emerging economies. India, for instance, is looking at entering the manufacturing sector and becoming a manufacturing powerhouse, getting more and more Apple investments away from China, manufacturing investments away from China. So actually, they're going to be competition in the coming years or so. So this is a problem with people who buy too much into the, let's say, I won't say propaganda, but the hype. Because if you really scratch below the surface, it's a far more complicated issue. Now, to be fair naman sa BRICS economies, their share of the global GDP has been increasing steadily. More so if you look at purchasing power parity, but the PPP actually doesn't properly measure global influence. We can have a different discussion about that. So you actually have to look at the nominal rates in order to appreciate how much more important the BRICS are. So just to give you an idea, this is a graph of more trade among BRICS countries, so you can see more and more increase, but clearly you can see China is just completely ahead of everyone else. So everyone else is kind of down there. China is the one exporting to the rest of them a lot, big time. So that's what I'm saying. It's hard to talk about BRICS when actually it's only China who's the major exporting powerhouse, especially in the manufacturing sector. And China is a top trading partner to all of the other BRICS countries, or at least number 2 or number 3. I think it's number 2 in Brazil. It's increasingly becoming number 1 in Russia. So actually, among the BRICS, they're more dependent on China for imports than the other way around. Although China, of course, also imports a lot of agriculture produced from Brazil. It also imports increasingly more oil and, to a lesser degree, gas from Russia. Nevertheless, as I said, there's a big big gap between China and the rest of the BRICS. So this is actually this is a better way of putting it. This is a graph that shows the growing share of BRICS countries the boom in their GDP. Again, look at the graph. Sorry. The light blue one is China. So again, if you look at the BRICS economies, really China is the big story. I mean, look at that graph. Easily what? Three-fourths, close to three-fourths, at least 65% of that is just China alone, right? So China is head and shoulders above all of the BRICS. I think nag-advertise ako ng shampoo without intending to, nakalibreng advertisement naman. So if you look at this service, it's really China which is the big boy here, right? In terms of GDP size, in terms of going trade, among BRICS countries and within BRICS economies, right? So this is something that you have to also keep in mind. That actually a lot of BRICS economies are worried because in the case of India, they feel that they lost on the first wave of globalization, manufacturing globalization because of China. In the case of Brazil, South Africa, and Russia, they're actually suffering deindustrialization as China becomes the top source of manufacturing imports, technological imports. And who knows down the road, even defense imports as China catches up with Russia and becomes a global defense force in exporting country in its own right. So, again, yun nga yung point ko eh. Yung mga shallow magbasa, walang masyadong alam. Ngayon lang nakarinig ng BRICS, BRICS, BRICS. Galit sa US, pro-tatay, mahilig sa pamparangay geopolitics. They'll jump on these ideas right away. But then again, you have to properly analyze it. You have to look at the bigger picture. Now, let's look at some of the graphs and surveys that actually show the US dollar is not as lousy as people think. Again, just to be absolutely clear about it, I am not a proponent of hegemony of any specific country or the US dollar. If anything, I think the US usage of its financial power to sanction many countries, Iraq in the past, Iran now, increasingly Russia, it may have its own geopolitical reasons to punish certain political leaders, whatever, but it's hurting a lot of ordinary people. Thousands of people in the Middle East, increasingly also in Russia, they cannot afford to buy medicines, they cannot get imported medicine, a lot of humanitarian goods because of US sanctions or the US leveraging of its financial power. So there are countries, for instance, like in Europe who want to still trade with, let's say, Iran, but they cannot because there's US sanctions there. So you get what I'm saying? So no, this is not coming from a position of ideological advocacy. Definitely not. I'm never happy with anyone having hegemony because that's always open to abuse. But the question here is, what is the alternative, and is the alternative really, really better, or even the alternative, whether it's really an alternative to begin with? Meron ba talagang clear alternative to the US? Now, if you look at actual studies and numbers, the picture is far more complicated actually. And complicated in the sense that it shows China is making gains, but nowhere close to where many people think. Now, just to put things into context, actually the US economy is still the biggest in the world in nominal terms. By far, you're looking at 25 trillion versus 18 trillion. Huge difference. In terms of defense spending, also US has a far larger defense budget than China. But more importantly, the US has a huge advantage over everyone else in terms of financial prowess. No? Let me just show you some numbers. So here I'm indebted actually to fantastic work by Brad Setzer of CFR. He has written very good stuff on this issue. Again, we're looking again at the data, no? So if you look at it, these are the numbers that show you the lowest. First of all, this one. Let me show you this. Saan ko nilagay yan? Dun sa mga komenta natin sa YouTube, don't worry about it. Popost natin itong mga numbers na to para ma-appreciate. Ito. So if you look at it, actually this is not from him, but it uses his calculation, plus the International Monetary Fund calculation. I got this from Bloomberg, Neil Ferguson's article. So look at the line there, mga kameta. The light blue one is para Ateneo color. That's US dollar. The black one is Euro. The gray one is Japan. The light gray one is China. So if you look at it, yes, China's share is increasing, and there's a slight decrease in America's share, but it's still by far the biggest. It doesn't even come close, right? So you have Australia, Canada, Great Britain there. So China is more like, China is not even in the top three. It's not even in contention for any medal. So US dollar is still by far, so again, you can see in the graph, sobrang laki ng share ng US dollar. Now in terms of value of US dollar, which reflects, confidence of other countries in US dollar, again, we can see that it's pretty steady if you average it over time. So from 1964 to 2021, over a 60-year period almost, mga kameta, you can see that US dollar real effective exchange rate has not significantly dipped. It's a bit lower than the early 1980s and early 1960s, but it's actually way higher than it has been since 1986, right? So actually it improved since 1986 in terms of its effective rate of exchange based on the data by Bank for International Settlements, right? So again, let's look at the actual data here. Now, even more detailed, ito yung mga, I suggest you check the Twitter of some of the experts here. I'll post it later on. So if you look at it, for instance, there's a slight dip here in terms of reported dollar reserves of different countries, yung green, pero ang laki pa rin, ang taas pa rin niya, di ba? It's lower than compared to say 2013, right? Or slightly around 2013, but it's still pretty high. It's still pretty high. Yung hindi gano'n ka strong shade, yung light green shade, that shows the other countries who are not reporting it fully. So actually, pag sinama mo, medyo mataas siya ngayon, similar to the levels of 2016 if you look at it, the graphs. So actually, there's no indication that the US dollar is being dumped by countries en masse because it's still maintaining very large share of the global exchange regime. And in fact, some of the reasons why the US dollar had a slight downward fluctuation was because super high interest rate ng US. We can have a separate discussion about that. And there are times whereby the euro became the backup option for a lot of countries who had issues with the United States. So actually, the one that benefited from a little bit downward fluctuation from the US dollar is actually sometimes euro, right? So euro has cemented itself as the second most powerful currency in the world. That's something that you have to keep in mind. Again, these are the data. Let's look at the data. Let's look at the numbers, mga kameta. Hindi yung mga kung ano ng mga ek-ek nang sinusulat dyan, sinasabi dyan. The data is very clear. In fact, it's very interesting. There's this Financial Times piece that looked at the supposed end of US dollar, but in that piece alone, so you can check it on your own, mga kameta, in that piece alone, you can see that there's still a recognition of how dominant the US dollar is. So this is the piece, and parang umiyak na yung US dollar, alright? But, in the same piece, mga kameta, you will read, this is on the Financial Times, written by Robin Wigglesworth. So in the same piece, it's very clear that if you look at it, ito, basahin natin mga kameta. I'll bring out also more data in yan. Ito. The Bank for International Settlements' latest triennial FX survey indicates that the US dollar share of all currency terms has actually climbed from 85% in 2010 to 88% last year. Okay, so let me show you the exact. Right, so let me show you. So this is the article that talks about the end of US dollar and yet still recognizes the fact that nag-increase pa nga yung share of US dollar. So it's still close to 90%, right? I mean, that's a level of dominance that is hard to displace anytime soon. Now, we're not cheering for it. We're just saying, let's look at the facts. So this is the key quote that I brought out, mga kameta. You can read it yourself. Again, alright. Oh yeah, okay. So look at the number. Okay. Again, this is what I'm talking about. We have to be evidence-based. We have to look at the data. Of course, going from 1% for China to 7% is fantastic. It looks sevenfold increase, but as a global share, it's still very, very small. In fact, it's not even at that level. Now, it's true that that the usage of renminbi or Chinese currency for trade with certain countries jumping heavily. That's clear. But again, we're talking about the global level. Now, what are the reasons why China is not expected to displace the US financial hegemony anytime soon? Is because, well, first of all, there are also other alternatives like euro and also yen, Japanese yen. Japan is still the third largest economy in the world. Eurozone is still collectively the second or first largest economic zone on earth, right? Those are the things that we shouldn't forget. But the more important thing here is that that the Chinese renminbi actually is not fully convertible, right? So you cannot, unlike dollar, you can convert it anywhere on earth because liberalizing current account in the US. You cannot do the same thing with Chinese renminbi. And in fact, the Chinese renminbi itself is pegged to the US dollar. Not to mention, mga kameta, China has what you call capital controls because the Chinese government is a little bit control-ish, right? Medyo micromanager. They want to have a lot of control over how much money can get out of the country because one big fear that China has is that if they fully liberalize the current account, maraming mga mayayaman na Chinese, ilalabas nila ng pera nila to put it in more safe havens. We already know that a lot of rich Chinese keep on taking out their money and bringing it to Australia, to New Zealand, to Europe, among others. Punta ka sa France, sa Provence, purong binili ng mga Chinese. I mean, there's a lot of outward investments from China, but that will be super next level if China fully liberalizes its current account. Having said that, though, there are two interesting. See, I'm being fair here. We're looking at all angles. Having said that, though, there are two important studies here that look at the possibility for China to steadily increase its share of global foreign exchange rates. Now, one is this interesting study by Ale Naff, Eric Monet, Barry Eichengreen, among others. It looks at renminbi's unconventional route to reserve currency status. So I suggest you guys read it on its own because it looks at the way by which even if Chinese renminbi is not fully convertible, because it's a top trading partner of many countries, more and more countries are feeling comfortable getting more and more renminbi, right? And they're also more comfortable of dealing with the Chinese central bank, right? To diversify away from dollar. Again, this is more of hedging than really finding an alternative. Another important study, if not even more important study, looks at the role of financial innovation. So historically, one reason why US dollar was easily able to supplant the sterling of UK was the financial engineering innovations that the US did in the second half of the 20th century. The argument here by Kimball and Feng Juan Xiao is that China is so effective in introducing new currencies, cryptocurrencies, Alipay, etc., that could kind of muddy the water and create a new dynamics by which China can accelerate exponentially its share of the global currency exchange. Because we're already now talking about even more and more alternative currencies, not hard currencies, but alternative currencies. Now, the same way that we went from gold standard to fiat money, now we can go from fiat money to other kind of alternative forms of currencies. Again, these are papers that are interesting and show the long-term potential of Chinese renminbi. But as I said again, there's still no evidence that the Chinese renminbi can replace the US dollar in the next year or even the next 10 years or so. So many are thinking maybe we're looking at the Chinese renminbi becoming a third largest bronze medal currency, as Ferguson puts it, maybe by the middle of the century, right? Steady increase. So US dollar will not be as dominant as it's historically been, but it's still expected to be around 50-60% of the share, with China moving up to probably 10%, EU moving to around 15-20%, yen maybe 5 to 8%. Those are the numbers we're looking at. So these things are important to keep in mind. Nevertheless, as I said, let's keep an open mind because we don't want to be ideological about this. Let's see how financial engineering, let's see how monetary policy in China and others could introduce new dynamics. Let's also see how the BRICS countries are going to deal with lack of complementarity among each other, and not to mention competition between India and China, not to mention China driving the industrialization in Brazil, Russia, and South Africa, which are increasingly turning into just mining sites for China in the more developed economies. No? So these are the dynamics that we have to talk about, mga kameta. I know this was a little bit maybe heavy or not bardagula as usually expected it, but mga kameta, this is what we want to do. Once in a while, at least do a kind of a semi-lecture. No? Again, hopefully one day, hopefully kung maayos natin ang setup natin all. I want to do proper lecture on this, maybe in my own show on TV or maybe in studio, maybe both. But for now, I just wanted to give you an overview of what is the current debate on this and ano yung mga angles na dapat titignan yung mga kameta when you want to make educated guess about the direction of the global financial Cold War that is happening between US and China. But all I can say for now is that it looks that US is in a very, very, very dominant position. All right. Are there any questions, mga kameta? Alright, thank you tayo dito sa mga nakikinig sa atin. Maraming salamat again, as always. Ayan, sino yan? See, the Fed looking to making its own crypto dollar. Okay, Pat is talking about that. Now, there was something very interesting said. Sorry, I didn't even quote Lula, Charles de Gaulle, etc. Because Lula and Charles de Gaulle actually, Charles de Gaulle more than 50 years ago already talked about the end of US dollar hegemony. Lula of Brazil has talked about it more recently. But again, the numbers are not showing a significant shift in the dynamics right now. All right. Uh, let's also see how the US deals with the issue of debt ceiling, because the Republicans are creating a lot of mess there. But at the same time, it's not like the US can go on just kind of abusing its money printing capability forever, right? So again, as I'm saying, I'm giving you a snapshot and also a long-term a view of the global currency markets. But then again, we can have a very healthy discussion about where things will be heading in the coming decades. I doubt in the coming years or even a decade or two, China will displace dollar. But I think clearly by the middle of this century, it will be in a very strong position to compete at least against euro, if not directly against the U.S. Right? Again, barring some world war or some crazy thing like that, God forbid. All right. Again, thank you so much. Again, digital yuan, right? Chinese money with expirations. Okay. Yung mga iba dyan, kino-comment kay, ayan, sabi ni Duterte at Mamba, magtiwala sa CCP, sabi ni Gameplay Tube. Oh, hindi ako nagsabi yan. Maraming salamat kay Maria Sebastian also for joining us, kay Jonathan Trinidad, kay Science and Facts. Ayan, good evening din sa'yo. Thank you very much kay Ma'am Jocelyn Lomber as always for your support. Ayan. Okay. Thank you very much mga kameta. Let's catch up soon. Marami pa tayong pag-usapan dito. Alright? Talk to you soon guys.